Hello upswingers and welcome to this video, which is going to be the first one in this whole section of the course, which is going to be about 3-bet pots. And we're going to start by talking about c-betting 3-bet pots when we are out of position on our opponent. So our opponent's opened under the gun to button and we have 3-bet from either the small blind or the big blind. And we're going to start by talking about c-betting on disconnected flops. And even more specifically, we're going to be talking about small blind versus button in this very first video. So in future videos, I'm then going to talk about how to adjust that when the opponent isn't on the button. So we're still in the small blind, but the opponent's maybe cut off, hijack, or under the gun. And then also how to adjust things when we're in the big blind. And the good news is I'm not going to go into huge detail on all of those things because there's just no way we can realistically expect to learn 8 completely different strategies on every board type, whether we're small blind versus button or big blind versus hijack or whatever else. So I'm just going to talk about some of the major adjustments that you want to make that are worth making and that are relatively easy to remember. And it does kind of work out okay to do that. You're not going to be making big mistakes doing that. So I think that's probably the best way to go about it. But yes, so this first video we're going to be talking about small blind versus button, and the making of this video has been cursed. I've had power cuts, PC issues and everything, but I am determined, so I'm going to tell the people how to c-bet on disconnected flops, small blind versus button. So we're going to go for it, and hopefully it'll work out this time. And yeah, so let's start by talking a little bit about how the ranges match up and what we can expect in this spot. So we're going to have some high pocket pairs and ace-king that our opponent doesn't have so much of because we're 3-betting all of those hands. We're going to be 3-betting aces, kings, queens, jacks, etc. and ace-king, obviously. And our opponent is going to be 4-betting lots of those hands. So when they flat our 3-bet, we're going to have an advantage there. So we're going to have some of the very strongest hands on different boards. So if we got a low board, we're going to have these high pocket pairs that our opponent doesn't have. If we've got a high board, we're going to be hitting sets that our opponent doesn't have, or maybe 2 pair of ace king on ace king X that our opponent's not going to have so much ace king in their range. So yeah, we're going to see that we're generally going to have a decent advantage in the ranges. Also, we're just generally 3-betting like fairly strong range from the small blind. So whereas our opponent was opening a much wider range than is having to defend quite a bit of it versus the 3-bet. So we're just a little bit stronger than our opponent in general. And being out of position, we kind of need to be stronger to actually have a betting range at all. And we are, so we are c-betting on lots of flops. The other thing to note is that we don't really, in these Monka Solver ranges, 3-bet many low suited connectors or particularly low pocket pairs, whereas our opponent just has a few more of those in their range, which they're raise calling. So we're going to hit low boards in terms of the actual board cards worse than our opponent does, although we still do have those overpairs. And our opponent will have some overpairs, but not necessarily the very highest ones. So we're going to see that have an effect on the strategies. And what we see on the higher flops is that we have one of those situations where lots of different sizing strategies are pretty similar EV, because we tend to have an advantage kind of throughout the ranges. So for example, there's, I'll go through some examples later, but basically we tend to have an advantage maybe at the 2 pairs or strong top pairs. So on an ace high, we've got ace king, whereas our opponent doesn't have so much. On a king high as well, we've got ace king. On a queen high, we've got aces and kings and so on that our opponent doesn't have so much of. So we tend to have an advantage at the top end, but then we also, because our range is slightly more high card heavy, we tend to have just more top pairs, maybe more second pairs, more high over pairs that are, or more over pairs or more pocket pairs that are just below top pair and so on. So we tend to have an advantage going through the ranges, and that means that we can choose different sizes without it really, there's not sort of, you don't have to clearly build your range around this particular size, because that's where all our, we've got a ton of hands that want to bet that size and not really hands that want to bet other sizes. So yeah, what I'm trying to say is similar EV for different sizes, and therefore you see with small differences in the board, you can see some different quite different strategies. So you'll see, it might be like an ace-8 deuce. It's betting very small and very large, and then an ace-8-4 or something. Just because things change slightly, it's betting a bit bigger and then a bit smaller with a 2-sizing strategy for both, or something like that. But overall, the pattern is pretty clear, though, that the program very much likes to have a 2-sizing strategy on these boards to take advantage of the fact that we do have these advantages higher up and also lower down in the ranges. And a default strategy of having 2 sizings, one of about 0.3 times pot, one of about 0.9 times pot, works pretty well. And again, this is the sort of thing that if you have specific sizes that you like to use because you have hotkey set up, or you just don't like to remember lots of different sizes, if you move that to third pot and pot, or quarter pot and pot, or whatever you want to do, it's going to be absolutely fine. It's not going to really have a big difference in EV. On a lot of boards, it will even be better to do the sizing you're going for, but then you'll be slightly further off when it actually wanted to do, say, 0.8 times pot or something, if you were using pot rather than 0.9. So yeah, you can change that around a bit if you like, but that seems like a pretty good average that would work pretty well. If you're one of those people who likes to be really accurate with things, then it does tend to be that the smaller size tends to be a little bit smaller on ace-high flops, so you might be going down to, say, quarter or even fifth pot for the smaller size rather than 0.3, and then if it's a queen high, you might go up to, say, a third pot or a little bit bigger. But I'm not sure, I probably wouldn't bother doing that. I think 0.3 and 0.9 works, just that's fine on its own, and then I don't think it's going to be feasible or worthwhile even to try and adjust that based on, you know, trying to imagine, oh, do we have slightly more top end hands here that might want to bet slightly bigger, or and maybe make the big size bigger or not. I don't think it's worth doing that. I think just using that strategy should be absolutely fine. On lower flops, we have something slightly different. So we still have a good advantage higher in the ranges because we've got these aces, kings, queens, jacks, etc. that our opponent's going to be 4-betting a lot. So we've got nice advantage higher in the ranges, but then, yeah, we don't hit the board much at all. So lower in the ranges, we don't really have much at all. And that means that we're going to actually drop the smaller size. So we're only going to be using the 0.9 times pot on lower boards. And I'm actually going to have a quick look at a lower board here to demonstrate this, because it's quite clear when you look at it. So if we go for, make sure we can see it. Yeah, so on the left here is our range for when we're deciding whether to c-bet or not, and this is after we check our opponent's range. So it's basically both players' ranges coming into the flop. And you can see here that we've got 1.8% trips and our opponent has 4.5% trips, and that doesn't really matter. So something that's worth talking about briefly, I guess, is as the stack to pot ratio gets smaller, the range advantage numbers right at the very top of the ranges get less important. So to demonstrate this clearly, imagine we're, say, 500 big blinds deep in a limped pot, and we have 5% of our range is sets and our opponent has no sets at all. So, and that's the strongest hand in the range. So we got 5% versus 0% right at the top of the range. We might, in that case, want to consider bombing in 3 big bets to get all in by the river with this range of hands that is just winning 100% of the time. So our opponent's going to have to call us down with at least some of their range, but we're going to win 100% of the time. So in that case, we're interested in this very top end of the range because it might not, depending on whether, you know, if we bet smaller, our opponent might raise us or whatever, but it might lead us to want to bet a very big size. So we're kind of taking that into account when thinking about how the range is matching up sort of leads to our sizings. If you think about something on the other extreme, so maybe it's a 3-bet or a 4-bet pot with quite shallow stacks, and there's only, you know, roughly a pot bet left, for example. So you think about whether to shove for pot or whether to check or bet smaller or something. Then in that case, the fact that we've got 5% versus 0% or 0% versus 5% is pretty irrelevant, because if we've got something that beats, say, 80% of our opponent's range, so that's basically good enough to get all the money in on this street. That's absolutely fine. So we're not really worried about the very top bits of the ranges as the stack to pot ratio gets smaller. So rambled a bit there, but that's just a point worth noting, I guess. So now that we're in 3-bet pots rather than single race pots, we care less about this sort of 1.8% versus 4.5 at the very top, is all I'm saying here. Not that it would have been a huge deal anyway, but worth noting. Nobody has any 2-pair. And then if we go into our 1-pairs here, you can see we've got 20% over pairs, whereas our opponent's only got 9.2%. And if you look at the actual over pairs we've got as well, we've got all these aces, kings, queens, jacks, etc., whereas our opponent has a bit of aces in these pre-flop ranges, but no kings, no queens, and then not a ton of jacks, really. They're 4-betting jacks a decent amount of the time. So we got a nice advantage there. Basically, 13% of our range or so is queens or better, and only 5% of our opponent's ranges. So we've got a nice advantage at the top there. And then when we go to total overpairs, it's about 22% of our range being overpair or better, and only about 14% of our opponent's range being overpair or better. And then we do have some top pairs, so it's sort of You can see we've got 3.7% top pairs here, and our opponent has slightly more. So our opponent's starting to catch up there. But yeah, we have top pair plus like 25% for us and 20% for our opponent. But then as you get down to the lower pairs, you can see our opponent's got a bunch of 7s and 6s and second pairs, 4s, third pairs and deuces. Whereas we have very, very little below top pair. We've got a bit of 7s through 6s, a bit of second pair, barely any third pair, no 4s, no deuces, etc. So when we get down to pair plus, we've actually only got 30% of our range being a pair or better. And our opponent has 38.6. And bear in mind, we had 25 or more than 25% of our range being top pair or better. So if we were thinking about having a small sizing strategy, there's just no real hands that want to have a small sizing that we've got in our range. We've only got about 4 or 5% of our range is made up of hands that, that beat an amount of our opponent's range that would mean that they would consider betting for a small size. So we just don't want to build a range around that, basically. Whereas we've got this whole chunk of 20% of our range which are overpairs and are wanting to bet pretty big. So we're going to build our range around those hands and for that size. I just thought it's worth going through because I think it's quite a clear example of why these range advantage numbers sort of match up into strategies the way that they do, because we just have this chunk of hands that beat a lot of our opponent's range. These overpairs, that are beating 86% or more of our opponent's range that are wanting to bet big. We've got lots of them, so we're going to have this bigger size. And yeah, we only have like 4 or 5% of hands that are in the range of wanting to bet small size, so we ignore those. And just to compare it to a higher board, so on say an ace king 8, then when we get down to top pair plus, we've got 41% of our range being top pair plus on an ace king 8, and our opponent has 31%. And we have 62% being second pair plus, and our opponent has 43%. So on the higher board, we've got this advantage going much lower in the ranges, which means we do have these chunk of hands that are willing to or wanting to bet a smaller size. So that's why we have the two sizing strategy on the higher boards, and on these lower boards, just the one sizing strategy and a size of 0.9 times pot works pretty well. So it's nice and easy. We basically have this two sizings of 0.3 times pot and 0.9 times pot, and then for lower boards we just drop the 0.3 times pot. So hopefully that's nice and clear and easy to understand, so hopefully it will be quite easy to remember. So if we go on to sort of our conclusions PowerPoint here for the sizings, then as I've said, we've got this default strategy of 0.3 times pot, 0.9 times pot on higher flops, and we lose the smaller size on lower flops. And if you're wondering about what counts as a higher flop, what counts as a lower flop, then the borderline is pretty much around jack high flops. So on 10 high flops and lower, it's really very clear that you're using the just one sizing strategy. So pretty much all 10 high or lower disconnected flops will only use one size, and it will be a pretty big one. It might be 3/4 pot, it might be pot or a bit bigger, but around 0.9 times pot is a good average. So we just go with that. And then queen high or higher flops, they will not always, but very, very often use a two sizing strategy with this one smaller size and one bigger size. And then jack high flops, it's kind of split. Some of them are using two sizing strategies, some are using one sizing strategies. And when you've got that option on a jack high flop, I'd probably go with the simple one and just go with a one sizing strategy on the jack high flops as well, of just this bigger size. But unless it's good to use two exploitatively, like if your opponent happens to play particularly badly against small sizes, then obviously you want to include a small sizing strategy where you can. So you would use the small sizing strategy as well on jack high flops, or the two sizing strategy, I should say. So onto frequencies then. So we've got this sort of default sizing strategy that's hopefully quite easy to understand and use. And then it's sadly not quite as simple as being able to say that the higher boards are better for us, and therefore we're just c-betting the highest frequencies, the higher the board is, and lower frequencies, the lower the board is. It's not quite that simple, because our opponent does kind of flat a disproportionate amount of ace-x, for example. So on an ace-high board, we're still doing well, we've still got an advantage, but our opponent is going to have quite a lot of lower ace-x, or quite a lot of ace-x. That means that we don't have this huge advantage lower in the ranges, so we're not just c-betting 100% on ace-high boards or anything. But our strongest boards tend to be king-high boards and two Broadway flops. So something like a Jack 10-3 for 2 Broadway, Jack 10-4, whatever, Queen 10-4, something like that. We're going to do pretty well on those because we've got we're doing pretty well on the top pair type hands still, because it's a high card and we tend to do better on high cards than our opponent does. And then also we've got the pocket kings, pocket aces that are giving us a bit of an extra advantage there. And then also the second card on the flop is still relatively high, so we're still doing reasonably on that. So it just means our advantage tends to carry down through the ranges, so we tend to do very well on the board like that. And then on king X, we just got more ace king, we've got king queen and so on, we've got pocket aces, and yeah, we just tend to do very well on king high boards. So we actually end up with 100% frequency, so we just see about 100% of the time on all of those boards, unless it happens to be one where our opponent really does better than us in terms of sets and 2 pairs. So there's an example of king 7-6 where we actually don't bet 100% because our opponent has more 7s, more 6s, they had 7-6 when we don't, and so on. So at the very worst king high boards for us, we're not going to 100%, but we're still probably c-betting a high frequency anyway. So if you were to just c-bet 100% on all king high boards, pretty much going to be fine. But if you do happen to think, hey, this king high board might be one of the worst for us because our opponent's actually going to do really well on the higher end of this board, then maybe you want to just drop the frequency a bit. Just to demonstrate how well we do on some of these king high boards, I'm going to have a quick look at one which is actually king high and 2 Broadway. So we've got a king jack 8 here. And if we get that up so we can see it, and open up the 1 pairs here, so you can see what's going on here. There we go. I was hovering over fold range. I was wondering why our opponent had no trips and 2 pair. So you can see we're just doing way better on trips and 2 pair. We've got 5.9% trips, 5.3% 2 pair, compared to our opponent's only got 2.7 and 1.8. So overall we've got about 11% 2 pair, our opponent's only got about 4.5%. Then we've also got aces more than 4% of the time, whereas our opponent's less than 1%. And then we've got the top pairs, and we can even open up that further and see we've got 8.5% of our range is ace king, whereas if we open that up, then only 3% of our opponent's range is ace king. So down to ace king plus, we've got 24% of our range is ace king or better. And only 8% of our opponent's range is ace king or better. So we just have this big chunk of hands, like 24% of our range is beating at least 92% of our opponent's range. So you can see why we're really, really strong here and why we have this big size. So in this particular case, we are betting 0.3 times pot and actually even a bit bigger than a 0.9 times pot standard, so 1 times pot. But yeah, just this huge chunk of hands willing to bet a bigger size. And then even as you go down further through the ranges, we've got this 11% of our range, 7.6% of our range being king queen, whereas our opponent only has 5.1. Then we've even got more lower king X, our opponent only has 2.9 and we have 6.2. And then we've got pocket queens and our opponent doesn't, and so on. So as we go down through the ranges, we've actually got 42% of our range being pocket queens or better, and only 17% of our opponent's range. So 42% of our range, massive chunk of it, beating at least 83% of our opponent's range. So really huge advantage, and that even goes down through to ace jack and so on. So huge advantage. You can see why we're never checking here. We're c-betting 100% on a board like this. So hopefully that should be quite clear. And then as we think about other boards then, so these are the boards we're c-betting 100% on. And then on the highest ace high flops, so you've just seen we're doing particularly well on king X, that we have more king X than our opponent does. So if we've got, say, an ace king 8 or something, we're going to be still c-betting a high frequency. Our opponent has enough ace X that we're not going to be up to 100% because they're, as I mentioned earlier, like a minute ago actually, we've only got 41% versus 31% top pair, whereas in this, on the king jack 8 we just looked at, we've got 38% versus 17%, so huge advantage at top pair plus. On an ace king 8 it's only 41% versus 31%, so it's a nice advantage. We're still c-betting quite a lot, but not going up to 100%. So on the highest ace high flops, going for sort of high frequency, and then like I said, the king high flops like king 7-6, which our opponent does a bit better on, still remaining a high frequency there, even though our opponent's doing better just because king high flops are so good for us. And then just on standard jack and 10 high flops, we don't have quite as nice advantage as we do on the king high flops, but we still have these overpairs that our opponent doesn't really have, and we still tend to hit the top pairs quite well and so on. So high frequency there as well. So it's really quite a lot of flops. Basically anything that's pretty high, or almost anything that's pretty high, other than the ones I'm about to talk about, are going to be, you know, high frequency or even 100%. Then the only real high flops that that's not going to be the case is the sort of standard ace high and queen high flops. And our opponent just has, like, our opponent's flatting ace queen basically 100% of the time versus our 3-bet. So our opponent having ace queen is already, like, so often is pretty bad for us on ace high or queen high flops. And our opponent also has quite a lot of ace jack in their flatting range, so ace jack offsuit a lot of the time. Also king queen offsuit. So yeah, ace and queen high flops not doing as well as we were on the king high and the jack high 10 fly, etc. There's like multiple offsuit Broadway hands that our opponent is flatting a lot of the time. So our opponent's doing a bit better there, and we're therefore going down to a mid frequency on ace high and queen high flops. So I guess when I said a minute ago that all high flops were betting a lot of the time, it's probably not really true. But so ignore that bit. But yeah, so they're king high, jack high 10 fly, we're betting often. Ace high and queen high, other than the very highest ace high flops, we are down to sort of a mid frequency or so about 50% or so there. On the lower flops, like I said, we have this advantage over pair plus, and you know, we looked at the 8-5-3, but lower in the ranges we're not doing very well at all. So we just have this chunk of hands that's driving our big sizing range, and we're going for a frequency of sort of mid-low to mid or so. So not betting anywhere near as often on these lower flops. And I think that's something that will hopefully be useful for people to hear, because it would be easy to just kind of think, oh, we got loads of overpairs because we 3-bet, so we're just going to c-bet like 90% or 100% even or whatever on these low flops. We're doing really well on those. Our opponent doesn't really have much, so we're going to do great and we want to c-bet loads. But that's not the correct strategy. It is actually to c-bet much less often, sort of mid-low or mid-frequency. And then finally, on lower ace-high flops, our opponent's tending to have a lot more sets and 2 pairs on lower ace-high flops, and like I said, doing better lower in the ranges as well with the sort of weaker ace-x. So we actually go down to a low frequency of c-betting on low ace-high flops. So yeah, we're doing well enough that we want to have a c-bet range. You know, if we were actually disadvantaged throughout the ranges, then we wouldn't c-bet at all, because you don't tend to bet out of position if you're disadvantaged throughout the ranges. But we have slight advantages in parts of the ranges, but yeah, our opponent will tend to have the more sets, more 2 pairs, and enough lower ace-x, like other ace-x, that we don't have a big advantage anywhere. So we're c-betting a pretty low frequency there. And of course, low frequency being about 20% of the time. So yeah, hopefully that's a decent overview for you of what our sort of strategies are going to look like on this small blind versus button spots on different board types. So the next video I'm going to make is talking about how to adjust that for other positional matchups, and then in the video after that I'll go on to hand selection and conclusions, etc. So I shall see you all for the next video, and I hope that was useful.